I'm going on a business trip. Don't you dare call me for anything trivial.
My husband yelled as he prepared for his weekend trip. I just mentioned that I'd contact him in case of an emergency, but he seemed irritated and clicked his tongue. No wonder he was upset, though. He wasn't going on a business trip. He was actually planning a getaway with his mistress.
Don't bother me. If you keep being a nuisance, I'll claim emotional distress and sue you.
My husband, threatening me for the most absurd reasons, seemed to have lost all sense of empathy. He ignored our sick daughter and always put his selfish desires first, neglecting his family. I couldn't stand up to him and was just trying to protect myself and our children. On the day of his business trip, I accidentally learned that my husband had been in a severe car accident. Despite this, I remembered his order not to contact him under any circumstances. Whatever happens to him is none of my concern now, and I don't need to reach out. Besides, I'm holding on to some very serious information that he's completely unaware of. I couldn't help but smile to myself as I turned off my phone. My name is Mary, 44 years old, a handmade artist who works from home. I've loved making accessories and crafts since I was a child and continued as a hobby even after starting my career. I got married at 28 and left my job. I had 2 children, a son in 8th grade and a daughter in 6th grade. I had to put my hobby on hold while raising the kids, but when my daughter started school, I picked it up again and began selling my creations online. My husband's name is John. He's 2 years older than me and was my senior in high school. We lost touch after graduation, but reconnected at an alumni event as adults. John worked in construction management, and we bonded over our shared interest in making things. He'd leave for work early and come home late if his tasks ran over. He always seemed stressed and exhausted, but he saw his job as his calling. John followed in his father's footsteps. His father also worked at the same company, holding a management position for many years, and continued working even after retiring from his official role. Seeing his father work so passionately, John wanted to do the same job ever since he was a child. His parents, both in their 70s, were very active. They traveled together monthly and often visited our home under the guise of taking a walk, though I found it intrusive. My relationship with them had never been great. From the start of our marriage, they often made tactless comments and did things that left me uncomfortable. They'd belittle my work, comparing it to John's, saying things like working from home isn't real work. They'd mockingly say it shouldn't even be called work if you're practically doing it for free. But the most troubling thing was their complete lack of understanding and empathy for others. My daughter Claire has a shellfish allergy and can't eat any food containing shellfish since she was a child. If she consumes it, it could be fatal, so I took the time to learn all I could about allergies and have always been very cautious when it comes to her meals. But John's parents didn't understand this at all and dismissed it as just a picky eating habit. They even tried to give her shellfish behind my back, almost causing a serious incident. How many times do I have to tell you that Claire can't eat shellfish?
It's just in her head, Mary. You're just coddling her.
If you gradually introduce it to her, she'll eventually outgrow it. I've never heard of anyone dying from an allergy. It felt like talking to a brick wall. To protect Claire, I made sure to never leave my kids alone when John's parents were around. I started making excuses to avoid their visits, but they began dropping by unannounced when I wasn't home. The thought of something terrible happening while I was away was terrifying. I repeatedly begged John to talk to his parents about not visiting when I wasn't around to keep Claire safe. Your parents put Claire in danger. Please talk to them and make sure they don't come over when I'm not here.
They're just trying to help out, Mary. They care about Claire. They have more experience raising kids than you, so just listen to them. You're worrying too much. I'm exhausted from work, so you deal with them.
John worked so much during the week that he barely saw the kids, and he didn't fully understand Claire's allergy. He always sided with his parents, leaving the household responsibilities to me while using me as his stress outlet. The only one who truly understood how I felt was our son, Ethan. Ethan didn't have any allergies, but he would check food labels for me and help protect Claire from John's parents. He adored his sister, and his growing disdain for John and his parents was clear. One day after John had left for work early as usual, I got a call from him around noon.
Can you clean up my parents' house today? My mom is at her exercise class, so I want you to tidy up while she's out. The kids are at school, and you're at home doing nothing, so it's no big deal.
I have work to do too, you know.
Don't act so high and mighty about your trivial work, just do it.
He hung up, pushing his mother's request onto me without a second thought. John had done this before, asking me for favors without considering my schedule. I didn't want to hear any more complaints, so I reluctantly headed to his parents' house. As I arrived and stepped inside, the phone rang. I assumed it was a sales call, but decided to answer. The caller was someone from John and his father's company saying that his father had left some important documents at home. They couldn't reach John's mother, so I grabbed the documents from the table and decided to take them to the office. Why do I always get dragged into these things? It was exhausting, being pulled around like this against my will, even if it was just a short drive. When I arrived at the company, I met one of John's coworkers, the one who had called. I remembered him from our wedding and from the times I had picked John up from company parties.
I'm sorry, Mrs. Brown. I didn't want to offend Mr. Brown's pride by calling him directly, so I called his parents' house instead. I'm glad you were there to help. His words seemed genuine, and he asked me to keep his matter a secret from John's father. As I was about to leave, he said something that made me stop in my tracks. By the way, how's your daughter doing? John mentioned her allergy. He said he's been taking days off to care for her.
I had no idea what he was talking about. John left for work as usual this morning. Thinking it was a misunderstanding, I asked for more details. It turned out that John had been taking time off work, claiming to care for Claire. I was stunned. There was no way this was true. Why would he lie to take time off? My head was spinning as I tried to make sense of it all. I drove home in a daze, lost in thought, and before I knew it, night had fallen. The kids were already asleep, so I tried to calm myself by watching TV. Later that night, John came home, late as usual, and immediately approached me, clicking his tongue in annoyance.
You didn't clean my parents' house today. Mom called to complain.
I realized that after going to John's company, I had completely forgotten to return to his parents' house.
You're always at home doing nothing, and you couldn't even clean? You probably went out for fun instead.
No, I went to the house, but then I had to take something to your father's office. John's eyebrow twitched, and he scratched his head, trying to cover up his reaction as he distanced himself from me. Normally I wouldn't notice, but I was suspicious now, and every move John made seemed shady.
Who told you to go to the company?
John seemed worried that his lie about taking the day off had been exposed. I could have confronted him then and there, but I decided to play dumb. I don't know. I handed over the documents and left. I forgot about the cleaning and came home.
Whatever. Just apologize to Mom tomorrow. I'm tired and going to bed.
He seemed relieved that his lie had been uncovered, and he headed to the bedroom. But I didn't miss the look on his face. John was clearly hiding something important from me. After thinking it over for a night, I reached the conclusion that John was probably cheating on me. And if he was using our daughter's illness as an excuse to cheat, I couldn't forgive him. Claire had already suffered so much because of her allergy. She couldn't enjoy the same food as her friends and was teased at school during lunch. Ethan and I were doing our best to support Claire both emotionally and physically. Meanwhile, John dismissed our struggles, claiming allergies were all in our heads, while using it as an excuse to take time off. I was consumed with anger and frustration, unable to sleep that night. The next day, unable to shake my suspicions, I decided to hire a private investigator to look into John's affairs. It was painful to spend the money I had earned from my online business, but I couldn't continue living in uncertainty. Every day, I anxiously awaited the investigator's report. A few weeks later, the results confirmed my worst fears. John was cheating on me. He skipped work 2 or 3 times a week, driving his mistress around and even spending nights at a hotel with her. The photos showed her to be a young woman, probably in her 20s. She had long black hair and a sharp, confident look, beautiful even to a woman's eyes. The results weren't surprising, but seeing them still left me speechless. The marriage I had built with John crumbled before my eyes, but instead of feeling sadness, I was filled with anger and disgust. I continued gathering evidence with the investigator and then went to see a lawyer. I started preparing for a divorce, learning about alimony, child support, and custody. My thoughts were already focused on the future with my children rather than the past I shared with John. I no longer had any lingering feelings for him. A few days later, John came home late again and casually mentioned that he'd be working over the weekend.
I have to work this weekend. The next job site is far away, so I'm going there for a preliminary survey. I'll be back on Sunday.
I knew it was a lie. John's job had always involved a lot of travel, but I had learned from his colleague that his role had changed a few months ago to an office-based position. There was no need for him to go on overnight trips anymore. He was probably planning a weekend getaway with his mistress. I see, but if something happens while you're away, I'll call you immediately. Claire's been under the weather, and you never know with Ethan. Plus, your parents are going on a trip, so we won't have anyone else to rely on.
I'll be working. You can't deal with any calls during that time. Don't call me for anything trivial.
John's voice grew angry, and it was clear he didn't want me to contact him that day. He was trying to cover up his plans by overreacting.
You're just sitting around at home. Stop bothering me. It's annoying.
John stormed off to the bedroom without another word, but his behavior only made me more suspicious. I pulled out John's credit card from its hiding place. I had secretly taken it from his wallet, annoyed that he might spend money on his mistress. I logged into the credit card company's website. John always used the same passwords, so I managed to log in easily. I saw a charge from a place that sounded like a hotel. I looked it up online and found that it was a luxury inn in a secluded mountain area, a place only accessible by car. He might have planned to say it was for his parents if I found out, but I knew his parents were going on a seaside hotel, not a mountain inn. John was definitely going there with his mistress. He was so excited about this trip that he didn't want anyone to ruin it. That explained his unreasonable anger. Disgusted by John's behavior, I opened an apartment rental website and made appointments for viewings over the weekend. When the weekend arrived, John left with his overnight bag, barely saying a word. Claire watched him leave while eating breakfast, and Ethan, still recovering from his cold, lay on the couch. After tidying up the house, I prepared to leave for my apartment viewings. I'll be back later, so take care of each other. Where are you going, Mom? I'll tell you later. Ethan, please look after Claire.
Got it.
I planned to tell them about the divorce after securing the apartment. John rarely spent time with the kids, and they didn't have a strong bond. Ethan resented his father for not understanding Claire's allergies, so I didn't think they would be too surprised by the news. John's parents were also away, so I didn't have to worry about them showing up unexpectedly. This was my chance. I spent the entire Saturday viewing various apartments and finally found one that met my criteria by the evening. Since it was too late to sign the contract, I decided to head home and return to finalize things the next day. I wondered if John was enjoying his trip with his mistress. The thought made me angry, but I reassured myself that I was making progress toward the divorce. On Sunday morning, I left the kids at home again and went to the real estate office. The contract process went smoothly. I signed the papers and paid the fees. It felt like I had been spending a lot of money lately on the investigator lawyer and now the apartment, but I considered it an investment in my future. Once I secured the apartment, I could cut ties with John and his parents for good. As I was leaving the real estate office, my phone rang. It was Ethan. What's wrong, Ethan?
Mom, it's Claire. She collapsed. We're on the way to the hospital in an ambulance.
I could hear the sirens in the background. My hands trembled as I held the phone. Ethan handed the phone to a paramedic who explained that Claire was in an anaphylactic shock. I couldn't understand how this had happened. I had been so careful with her meals, making sure there were no allergens. I rushed to my car, but I was so shaken that I struggled to remember how to start the engine. I decided to call John, despite my reluctance, because this was an emergency. If he was at the inn, he should have checked out by now, but no matter how many times I called, John didn't pick up. I felt a surge of frustration, but it also helped me regain my composure. I gave up on calling John and headed straight to the hospital. When I arrived at the hospital, I found Ethan waiting outside the exam room. Is Claire okay, doctor?
Please, calm down, Mrs. Brown. Claire is stable now. Her blood pressure dropped, but she's resting peacefully.
Hearing that she was safe, I felt a wave of relief. Tears welled up in my eyes as I realized how close we had come to tragedy.
Your son acted quickly by calling the ambulance. He's a remarkable young man.
Ethan looked down, but I was proud of my son for protecting his sister. The doctor explained that Claire would need to be hospitalized, and I went home to get her insurance card. As I gathered the insurance cards from the file, I noticed John's was still there. If he was staying overnight, he should have taken it with him, but I didn't have time to dwell on it. I rushed back to the hospital confirming that Claire was stable and began the admission paperwork. As I was filling out the forms, Ethan nudged my arm and pointed to a large TV screen in the hospital lobby.
Mom, look at that.
The screen showed a breaking news report about a single car accident on a mountain road causing traffic delays. The footage showed a car that had crashed through a guardrail and was badly damaged in the front. But the rear of the car, where the license plate was visible, was relatively intact. Ethan and I recognized the car immediately. The accident had occurred on the road leading to the secluded inn John was supposed to be visiting. It didn't take long to realize that John had been in the accident. The 2 passengers in the car were taken to the hospital, but their injuries are not life-threatening. So, he was with a woman.
That's Dad, isn't it?
Yes, it is. Ethan was old enough to understand what was happening. He didn't say anything after that, but I wondered if he had already guessed that I was planning to divorce John. I felt ashamed that I had let things get to this point, making my children worry. Just then, my phone rang again. It was John. I hesitated to answer, but then I remembered his words.
Don't call me for anything trivial.
As soon as the ringing stopped, it started again and then again. John kept calling, desperate now that he was in trouble. The irony was unbearable. I had called him earlier when it was an emergency, and he hadn't answered. But now that he needed me, he was blowing up my phone. I decided to ignore his calls. It wasn't unusual for someone to turn off their phone in a hospital after all. After finishing the paperwork, I took Ethan home. As we arrived, we saw John's parents standing outside the house despite it being late. I was already exhausted from the ordeal with Claire, and dealing with them was the last thing I wanted. I left Ethan in the car and approached them.
Mary, where have you been in such an emergency?
We've been trying to reach you. I have my phone off.
John was in a car accident and needs surgery. He's in the hospital for 2 weeks. He called us when you didn't answer.
Oh, is that so? That's all you have to say? How could you be so calm when your husband is in such a serious condition? Do you even care about him? Her words ignited a simmering anger within me, and I finally snapped. I was ready to end this toxic relationship, so it didn't matter anymore. Claire was rushed to the hospital in an ambulance today. She had a severe allergic reaction and her life was at risk. I know you've heard this before, so don't pretend you don't know what I'm talking about. I pulled something from my bag and showed it to John's parents. Their expressions changed, a clear sign that they were guilty. They scratched their heads nervously, a habit they shared with John when they were caught off guard. Ethan told me that you came to our house today. You said you were bringing back souvenirs from your trip. John's parents had gone to a seaside town they frequently visited about 2 hours away. They had planned to stay overnight as usual, but they had forgotten to book the hotel. When they found that all the other hotels were full, they returned home early. This morning, they brought the souvenirs to our house. Ethan asked what the souvenirs were, and you showed him the usual rice crackers. Ethan thought it was fine since Claire often ate those crackers, so he went back to his room. After he left, Claire started having a reaction in the living room. I took the rice crackers to the hospital and they found 2 different kinds in the package. One was the usual flavor, but the other contained shrimp. I did some research online and found that these shrimp crackers are limited edition, but the box only had the regular flavor on it. Did you give Claire the shrimp crackers and then hide the box?
Well, we thought it would be fine. It's just in her head, after all.
I asked a lawyer about this. Intentionally giving someone an allergen when you know they're allergic could be considered assault. That's ridiculous! We were just thinking of you when we bought them. I've told you over and over again not to feed Claire anything. You knowingly bought something dangerous and then had the nerve to think you were doing us a favor? I'll never forgive you for endangering Claire's life. I finally unleashed the anger I had bottled up for so long. If I had been firmer with them earlier, Claire might not have had to suffer.
Now's not the time to talk about this. We came to tell you about John's accident. Don't you care about that?
I don't care at all. He was on a trip with his mistress. I showed John's parents the evidence of his affair that I had gathered from the private investigator. They were stunned. He used our daughter's illness as an excuse to take time off and lie about a business trip so he could cheat. Why should I worry about him? I'm filing for divorce and will be suing both him and you for damages. As I finished speaking, a police car pulled up outside the office, sirens blaring. I had asked Ethan to call the police while we were driving home. The officers approached John's parents and asked them to come to the station for questioning about the possible assault. John's parents panicked and tried to resist, but they were quickly taken away. 2 weeks later, I had got a call from an unknown number. It was the hospital where John was staying. Since we were still married, he had listed me as his emergency contact.
Mrs. Brown, I'm sorry to bother you, but Mr. Brown has been causing a scene, demanding that we contact you.
I didn't want to see John, but I didn't want to cause trouble for the hospital staff either, so I reluctantly visited his room.
Finally you're here, you useless wife. You've been ignoring all my calls. What's going on?
After the accident, I had ignored all of John's calls. His hospitalization had been convenient for me. I had almost finished preparing for the move and had already consulted a lawyer about the divorce. Thankfully, Claire had been discharged after just one night, and when I told Ethan and Claire about my plan to divorce, they supported me wholeheartedly. All that was left was to get rid of this worthless husband. I didn't answer your calls because you told me not to. You ignored my calls too, so I figured you were busy. I feigned innocence knowing it would infuriate him.
Just listen to what your husband tells you to do. And you took my credit card, didn't you? I'm supposed to be discharged today, but I don't have my insurance card, so the bill is too high to pay. Go to the front desk and pay it.
I didn't bring your insurance card. Ask your parents for help.
Don't be ridiculous. I can't call them because you got them arrested. They're in jail because of you. These past 2 weeks have been hell, and I'm going to sue you for emotional distress.
His shouting was unbearable, even in a private room. The nurse looked like she didn't want to get involved. I had been holding back, but I had finally reached my limit. I'll be the one suing for alimony and child support. Don't pretend you don't know why. I know exactly where you were and what you were doing. I have proof. I showed John the evidence, the same evidence I had shown his parents. The file had grown thicker since I first started collecting it. John was visibly shaken as he saw the evidence piling up against him. I've already consulted with a lawyer and you'll be hearing from them soon. Ethan and Claire know what you've done, and they support the divorce. I'm going to be a single mother, so I'll need you to pay alimony and child support in full.
There's no way I can afford that.
I know you can't. You've barely been working, using Claire as an excuse.
How did you know that?
I don't care about the details. Just get the money and be done with it.
I can't pay that much.
John was starting to panic, realizing that I was serious about the divorce. Suddenly, a young woman walked into the room. She had long black hair and an air of confidence. It was John's mistress. Both John and I were surprised by her sudden appearance.
You must be John's wife. Since it's all out in the open, I'll tell you. I'm the one who was with John on the trip when the accident happened.
Don't say anything!
The mistress, whom John called Jessica, had the same strong gaze as in the photos. I took a deep breath and replied to her. Thank you for the introduction. I heard you were injured in the accident.
I wasn't seriously hurt, so I was discharged quickly. I've been listening to your conversation and heard that you're planning to divorce John. That's actually convenient for me. I'm in love with John, and I want to be with him.
Wait, I haven't agreed to a divorce yet, and I don't have the money to pay for it.
If you choose me, John, I'll pay for everything. I'll cover the alimony and any other expenses. I just want you to divorce her so we can be together.
Really? That would be a big help. You're willing to take responsibility for him even after everything?
Yes, I am. I want to be with John free of any complications. What do you say, John? Will you accept my offer?
Jessica was willing to pay for everything in exchange for being with John. John was stunned at first, but then he seemed to make up his mind.
Yeah, that would solve my financial problems. And Jessica is younger and prettier. If I choose her, I can still have a good life. Jessica, you're my true partner. Let's get married and be happy together.
Oh, I'm so happy. I've always wanted to be with you, John.
They embraced, whispering sweet nothings to each other. The sight was so absurd that I couldn't help but laugh. John had no idea what he was getting into. I learned through the investigator that Jessica had a secret.
With you, John, I'm sure we can build a strong future together.
What do you mean?
As if on cue, several men dressed in black entered the room.
John, you don't know who I really am. I'm Jessica, the granddaughter of the head of a crime family.
What? You're the granddaughter of a mob boss?
The men surrounded John, who looked like he was about to faint. If he tried to escape, his life would be over. I smiled at them and said, "Good luck with your future together," as I left the room. A month later, thanks to my lawyer's swift actions, my divorce from John was finalized. John ended up owing Jessica for the hospital bills and the car accident, as well as my alimony and child support. Jessica kept her word and paid everything in full. I was impressed by her sense of honor, even if it was twisted. But with no way to escape his debts, John was forced to marry Jessica and become part of the crime family. He had to quit his construction job, and from what I heard, men in black had been lurking around the company until John's departure. John's father was also fired as the company didn't want to be associated with such a scandal. Rumors had already spread about him getting involved with the police, so it was only a matter of time before he was pushed out. With their son and grandson disgraced, John's parents couldn't show their faces in public and became virtual recluses. Both John and his parents had brought this on themselves, destroying their own lives. I would make sure my children learned from their example and understood the importance of empathy. After starting a new life, my children and I finally found peace. Claire recovered fully with no lingering effects, and she's as cheerful as ever. I don't know if she'll ever outgrow her allergy, but seeing her smile alongside Ethan made me feel secure. My handmade business had finally taken off, and I was earning as much as I had before I quit my job. I'm determined to keep making things that bring joy to others. And when I've saved enough, I plan to take Ethan and Claire on a little luxury vacation to celebrate our new life together.